I'm here again with Pastor David Syme, who has lived and worked in many different capacities in many different countries as a missionary, as a medical officer, as a pastor. And David, I'm curious, as you reflect on your life and as you reflect on bringing and sharing God and Christianity with those that you've worked and lived with, did you, and feel free to answer this however you like, but I imagine that when you first, as a young man, you and your wife and family, are there in Ethiopia where you first began, you came with a Christian culture. You would have experienced a different local culture and a different faith there on the ground in the community that you were serving. And maybe as a young missionary, you also encountered a Christianity that existed before you came, and that might have had its own culture.
Yes.
And I wonder, as you reflect on your life, how did you manage and navigate those multiple different cultures of Christianity?
Yeah. It's an interesting question and probably a fairly big question, but and again, different people would answer in different ways. I think going back to the requirements of being such a worker and such a person, the fact of knowing that and believing that God is there, and that's an important facet to remind yourself of. But in adapting and dealing with people of other cultures, or even multicultures in some instances, I think everyone it's been a kind of a minefield of trying to see how you do that. Let me just give you a quick insight. Soon after we arrived in our starting place, as it were, this platform that has been the foundation of our career together as a family, I delivered a baby one day. The first baby I had delivered there, and the first baby I'd ever delivered, and it was quite a difficult delivery. And I was very happy that I'd actually been able to perform the complicated birth with a live child and a healthy mother. As soon as the baby cried, the husband, who was outside when I came out of the delivery room, fell at my feet, grabbed my ankles, and was shouting, "Wakayo, Wakayo." Well, I didn't speak much. That's Oromia, and it's the word for God. Okay. I didn't speak very much Oromia at that time, and so I felt that I knew it was the word for God. That was all. And so I bent down and just literally dragged him up, shaking my head and saying, no, I'm not God. And I couldn't say it in Oromia, I'm saying it in English. And the translator is trying to translate, no, I'm not God. God is up there. And I found that this became a regular thing. Whenever there had been some successful treatment or other, there was this thing that happened. And it wasn't until some while afterwards I realized, as I knew a bit more of the language, that they were not calling me God. They were saying, through what you have done for us, God has come to us, which is a totally different thing. And then it starts to make you think that these people who have their own understanding of God see God coming to them through your actions and through your love toward them.
Absolutely beautiful.
And so in that setting, I always try and see it. And time again through my whole career, I have seen that. I have a friend called George Baden. He's a Ghanaian, fine Adventist Christian, and he's still working for people up in northern Ghana. And George always used to tell me, he said, David, in Africa, God is never far away. And it's absolutely true. The reality is that even though there may be different gods, the gods of the rocks and the other things, they are faith bound, as it were. That culture has a component, I call it a horizontal component. In our lives, we're grown up, we go to school, we deal with subjects, we deal with verticality. And so we learn economics, we learn maths, we learn English, we learn geography, we learn all of these things in silos.
Sure.
And they don't talk to each other very well. And then we get to degree level and we start specializing and what have you, and we get to narrower and narrower silos. In the Africa of that time, and it has changed tremendously today and become more westernized, but in the Africa of that time, they looked at life as being horizontal.
Okay.
And the foundation was their God.
Right.
Now, that could be a God in many reasons. It could be the Islamic Allah. It can be a Coptic Christian, because Christianity existed, as did Judaism in Ethiopia since the time of Manasseh, 1500 years before Christ. So it's a unique country in Africa because of its history. And of course, it's mentioned in the Bible, so we know that it is there. So in these settings, one needs to recognize and understand where each individual is coming from. When I got in the bath for the first time in the new house that we had, is the water that was piped down from a stream, and where the cattle drank from and muddied themselves in, was chocolate brown. That was the cleanest it was, and I came out probably dirtier than I ever had. And I determined I was going to do something about that. So we found a spring up at the mountain. And this spring was on a certain farmer's land. And there was beautiful, fresh water. I can taste it in my mouth now. Absolutely beautiful water just running out and then running into the main stream that was running nearby. I wanted permission from him to be able to build a little dam in concrete and take the water to the clinic, and at the same time put pipes along for the community to have fresh potable water. Good project. Someone funded it, and so we did it. But in order to get permission, he was worried because every year at that spring, he sacrificed a goat to keep the gods happy and to say thank you for the water that came. So what do I do in that setting? He was worried about, could he sacrifice his goat if I had put a concrete platform on there?
Okay.
And basically, I made the decision and said, yes, you can, because it won't affect the water that's coming out underneath. That gravity flow water is still flowing today, all the way to the clinic and the broader community. I met the man 3 years ago when I went back to Ethiopia. He was very, very old, probably about 90 years old. And I actually met him at that time. When I did it, I gave him a pair of my trousers to wear. And when I went back 3 years ago, he asked me for another pair of trousers. But it gives an example of how the interface with culture, there are some things that you would refuse immediately and say, no way. But in this setting, it was simple. He believed in sacrificing a goat there. It didn't affect. It wasn't our property. It was on his land and what have you. So, I didn't get upset with him or those kind of things.
Even though it might have been something that didn't fit into your faith practice.
No. Doesn't, completely. But in those days, patients would come in describing their symptoms. And I remember on one occasion, a man came in with a urinary tract infection, which was quite common in that area. And so I asked him what had caused it. And he told me immediately, he said, I was passing water. He said, as under the new moon, and an owl flew past and hooted at me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, strange, but you don't say, oh, that's ridiculous. You need, here's some tetracycline to deal with it. You give him the medicine, you tell him he needs to drink more fresh water, to keep those kind of things. People had an idea, for instance, that a stethoscope was an X-ray in those days. Probably someone had been to a hospital, had an X-ray of their chest, but the doctor had also examined them beforehand, so they knew that you could have a picture. So the people we were dealing with there believed that it was the ears. And because most of us, when we're listening to a chest or what have you, tend to shut our eyes so that we can kind of shut everything out to listen to the heartbeat or whether there are rails in the chest and what have you, they would think that we're actually looking inside, at that time, inside their bodies. So consequently, because of that belief, you just don't throw it away and say, oh, that's silly. But then they'd come and say, I've got a headache. I want an X-ray. I want a Raji Mara Mara. And so you say, am I going to put it on the head when I know I can't see anything? So what I used to do it once, and we kept a patient card. And then I said, a Raji Mara Mara on it. So when they came again, and they had it, I said, they knew that I'd already looked inside their brain, so I don't need to do anything. So we kind of softened things, and gradually, as education came and people got more used to it, you adapt. So I think there are some cultural things we can and should adapt to, but there are other things absolutely that we would need to say, no way, that is beyond the pale. And each person must make their own decision in that, what they feel comfortable with. So I don't think you can have a strict policy. You may have it in your mind, but I think sometimes we do have to understand where people are coming from and gradually educate. Education is everything. There was no school there, no schooling. We started a little school. When I went back 3 years ago, 1,200 students all the way to 12th grade. Fabulous to see all of that happening and huge changes. And the church has grown tremendously as a result of the clinic, because for them, those people, as we're hearing another story, those people think it is their Jerusalem.
Right.
That when it was built, Jerusalem had come. Yeah. So there are other things that you have to adapt to too.
What about coming back to Australia?
Yeah.
You're retired now, but the lessons that you've learned there, do you apply here in terms of adapting to the culture in which you now live?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've just come from my wife's relatives, a week of them, who are country people up in central West Queensland. And I must confess that, over the years have not shown very much interest in. They've never asked us, why are we missionaries? They know we were missionaries, but they haven't talked much about faith. And we haven't pushed that matter with them. And one of the relatives said to me the other week, so are you still preaching? And I said to her, I preach, I try and preach through the way in which I live so that can speak to people. And she immediately accepted that and nodded her head, and other people do too. So it's a good question. I've never really reflected very much on it. And I think it's a good one, but I am very much influenced by what happened in those early days. And it's been a great learning experience, for me. I'll just tell you one other story that, is more modern. Everyone's heard of Mother Teresa. When I was at the General Conference and I lived in Washington, D.C., I sat on a committee of non-government organizations, or private voluntary organizations, they call it in the States. We were establishing a conference on poverty in New York, to be held in New York, and we wanted a keynote speaker. And we said, we would like Mother Teresa to come out, and we'll pay her way to come and open
from
the conference.
Calcutta,
yes,
in
yes,
India to New York
with the opening address. And she came, and there was probably 200-300 people at the conference, in the conference hall. We had met her at the airport, and she came. And she walked to the stage to great applause, as you can imagine. And she said, "Thank you so much for inviting me to this important conference. I now declare it open, and now I must leave to get back to my work in Calcutta," and walked off the stage. And there was a hushed silence, as you can imagine. But it was an incredible statement of her faith and belief that what she was about was more important than sitting and discussing it, but actually doing something. Tremendous. I mean, the impact, it was almost like the whole conference was shut down because, we should be out there doing it. So I think we have to find ways of seeing this blend between exercising faith in terms of witnessing to our faith vis-a-vis demonstrating. So there is a declaration, but there is also a demonstration of our faith. And both of those need to be in sync, but both of them are sanctified by God, in my belief. And we don't say one is greater than the other. The two, it must exist in some kind of relationship, and we need to keep both happening. Maybe further stories next week will help us understand that.
Thank you, David. That's fantastic. All right, stay with us.